Good morning, everyone. It is summer, Friday the 13th, and I have my first summer cold. So if my voice sounds funny, you can blame my son Ryan. Um, we um, we have a lot to cover here, and I will get right into it. We have a lot of things that are getting good media coverage in the state, and more attention being paid to how these Medicaid cuts will impact rural health care. So this was an article that ran in Wisconsin media markets, but also linked to a deeper report about how Medicaid cuts would disproportionately impact rural hospitals and places. So many of our places in Wisconsin are rural, and these ideas impact a good portion of our state. The person who was being interviewed for this particular article was in Adams County. And you can see the last bullet here says, hey, 72% of the people that we serve are either on Medicare or Medicaid. So it's a really important payer source for a lot of rural hospitals. And of course, the more people who lose coverage, who don't have Medicare or Medicaid, there's less payer source for those hospitals. So just a kind of deeper dive into, a national problem, but also an issue in Wisconsin about how do we have support our healthcare providers in rural places. And a lot of times the answer is through Medicaid. Our Medicaid director has been out across Wisconsin. Some of you may have heard him talking on Wisconsin Public Radio. And this was kind of a nice article where he was really making the case that these cuts affect the whole healthcare economy. Again, because Medicaid is one of the major payer sources that's supporting and paying the workers who are in hospitals and clinics and other settings and providing care. We're going to get into the department released an analysis this week about what do they think the provisions in the House budget passed bill would do to Wisconsin. And a little preview on this slide, they were talking not only about Medicaid, but also food share and how many more people that would be impacted by the prove you are working or exempt requirements. Almost 200,000 people, and that some portion of them are at high risk for losing coverage because they are not currently meeting that 80 hours of community engagement. All of those people, everybody in Medicaid would have to have more paperwork, either to prove that they were working or exempt. But certainly they were honing in on a certain group who, would be subject to the work requirements and are not currently meeting them now. Another small issue that we learned about in the last week or so is, some of our friends at Georgetown University are pointing out that the actual bill language doesn't require states to provide automatic exemptions. So some states, depending on how they make decisions on how to implement these things, may choose to, not automatically exempt certain groups of people, which would mean that everybody has to do more paperwork. And, I don't think Wisconsin hasn't made any of those decisions yet, but it is important to know that there's very little detail in the bill about how states have to do things, which means states have a lot of decisions to make and also limited, they have the technology systems they have and they have the money they have. So that in fact influences how these things may get implemented. So the Department of Health Services released a new estimate of the impact on the federal budget bill, and they kind of looked at it from two perspectives. How many people would be at risk of losing their coverage, and how much money would it cost the state to administer those changes. So bottom line, when you look at both the cuts to Medicaid and the changes to the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, about 250,000 people in Wisconsin are at high risk for losing their health care. That means they either aren't meeting the requirements as they are outlined in the bill now, or that they are much more likely to not be able to afford their marketplace plans and choose to forego coverage. Um, the analysis says there are about 63,000 people who are at high risk of losing their Medicaid coverage, and those are really the people who aren't yet meeting the 80 hours of community engagement that the bill would require. That doesn't mean that only 63,000 are at risk of losing their coverage. It means that they've identified a group of people who aren't meeting what is in the bill right now. And there are certainly many other people who might be subject to either proving they're working or exempt who could be at risk of losing coverage because of paperwork mistakes. Either they fail to get something that is needed in on time, or the state makes a mistake and it could cost somebody's coverage. So I would look at these numbers as kind of the most conservative estimate of who is at risk of losing coverage, and understand that the actual number of people who lose coverage could be a lot higher than that. And they're calculating that just administering, all the paperwork, if you're required to submit paperwork, somebody has to look at it, check it, determine whether it's okay or not. There's a lot of process that has to be designed to accommodate these new administrative, bureaucratic, red tape procedures. It would cost us about $74 million a year to do that just for Medicaid alone. That's not insignificant. In a state biennial budget, you're looking at almost $150 million that Wisconsin is not currently spending just to move more paperwork around that isn't required now. So it's a pretty big bill. I don't know about you, but I can think of a lot of things I would do with $150 million, and it likely wouldn't be paperwork. The analysis DHS put out also identified of those 63,000 people who are at high risk of losing coverage because they're not necessarily meeting that 80-hour community engagement standard that's in the bill. Where are they? And they broke them up by county, which I think is fairly useful for those of you who are, doing a lot of local work with local reporters. Some of these counties have bigger populations than others. But it gives you a sense of, here are tangible numbers of people who are likely to lose their Medicaid coverage, and they are all over the state. And they don't necessarily even know they're at high risk of losing their coverage because they may not know that these changes could be coming. And it could impact lots of different kinds of people. So I've kind of put in some bullet points here to give you a flavor of who are the people in your neighborhood that could be at risk of losing coverage, at high risk of losing coverage. And these are the kinds of people that are likely working already in Medicaid, but maybe not enough. Maybe they just got laid off from a job, or they had their hours cut this month, and so they would have made the 80-hour threshold, except the employer changed something and now it's less. There's a lot of caregivers who, even though there's a caregiver exemption, it's unclear how you prove that and what duties would be count as caregiving and how you document it. There's obviously lots of people who are in Medicaid who are actively sick. These are the kinds of people where even if they are not at high risk, according to DHS, because they're not meeting the community engagement requirement now, you can certainly see that in the 1.2 million group of people who are in Medicaid, any one of these things could happen and put their coverage in jeopardy if these requirements were to go into effect. So it's kind of a nice visual to be able to see that, yeah, every county is impacted and has people that are really at high risk of losing coverage. And again, this is the floor, not the ceiling for who might lose coverage. Um, the department was also very clear about how they think the federal budget bill will impact Wisconsin. And you'll notice the first thing on the analysis is this idea of more paperwork and red tape for people to prove that they're working or exempt. That is a major reason why people are going to lose coverage. And the main place where the state is incurring costs that it doesn't have now. They also talk about increasing medical debt and incompensated care. Obviously, if you don't have healthcare coverage and you have healthcare needs, um, either you are going to receive that care and go into debt because you cannot pay the bills, or the healthcare um, facility is going to treat you and not get paid for treating you. So both of those things are really detrimental to the individual, but also our rural healthcare systems. The department is really clear that, you know, we have a low uninsured population in the state right now. These changes will increase it. And the Congressional Budget Office has been very clear that when taken into account, the changes to Medicaid and to the ACA marketplace in the reconciliation bill, plus the expiration of the marketplace tax subsidies, are looking at about 16 million people who are insured today who would not be insured after basically the first of the year. And then they also identify that there are some changes that would really limit, you know, how the state could draw down additional federal dollars. And they're mostly, I think, referring to provider tax changes there. So as you're thinking about, you know, working with your local press and working on your social media accounts, I think it's really important to put faces on Medicaid, and I think the DHS analysis is good because it provides you some numbers of how many people in specific locations, and you can use just a little bit of imagination to kind of paint a picture of who those people are. But for many of our folks, Medicaid is very personal because we are already in it. And I think that drawing that connection of when you think of Medicaid, you're thinking of me, and there's no protecting me from Medicaid cuts is a really important message for local papers and local counties to understand, because this is starting to get very granular if you're looking at, you know, hundreds of people or thousands of people in your county being at the highest risk for losing coverage. You at some point you start to know who those faces are, and you're one of the faces that's touched by Medicaid. A number of folks had some good luck with getting letters to the editor printed last week. This one was particularly good in the Capital Times. Lots of people had some strong reactions to Senator Erst's comments from a couple weeks ago. And I think that, you know, the more kind of personal reactions and connecting the dots that you can have in local papers, the better it is. Everything that gets published is one more, you know, one more thing that can be shared, one more addition to the pile of things that are building up and accruing and adding to the discussion on Medicaid. This article is about Katie Beckett, and I included it not to you know, put the department under the bus or anything, but as a reminder that paperwork mistakes happen now and coverage disruptions happen now. And many of you may have experienced something similar to what this family has experienced in the article, or gotten some letter that has thrown your heart into beating faster, or confusion when you think that maybe you are no longer in Medicaid. And I think that it's important to kind of put a face on, like, look, when mistakes happen, there's real consequences. It happens occasionally now. But when you have more and more people who have to do more paperwork and go through more red tape, the risk of making these kinds of mistakes that have this kind of consequence is much higher. And I think it's useful to make that connection for reporters and people in your life to say, like, look, the risk of a mistake, the risk of me losing coverage means these things for me and my family. And some of those things, even if they're resolved, they may not be resolved in a timely enough manner to avoid real harm. And I think that's a misconception that somehow we're putting in a lot of paperwork requirements or red tape, and if you lose your coverage, it's just a matter of fixing it, and that, like, we kind of lose the impact of the amount of time and stress and what happens when you do lose your coverage, that is really, really significant for especially a lot of families like the ones that we know. Next week, we're going to be doing an event in Dodgeville, that's specific on the impact of Medicaid cuts to caregivers. Lots of reasons why these cuts are going to add to the workload of caregivers. And so we're going to take some deep dive into that. So if you can come to that event, please feel welcome to do so. And now we'll get into what Congress has been doing this week. So I'm going to start with some polling. And this is not the only poll that's been released. There have been a couple more polls released since the YouGov poll. I'm looking at the YouGov poll here. The Quinnipiac poll is another pretty big one. But this one was released on Tuesday. And it was taken in the snapshot of time before the bill passed the House. So about 4 days before the bill passed the House. So you can see that this is a snapshot in time from about 3 weeks ago. And certainly in the 3 weeks since the bill has passed, there have been more people who continue to learn more about it. So you would assume that, perhaps if the same poll was taken today, the results might not be exactly the same if all of us who have been working hard to help people understand what's in this bill have been successful. And I think there's a couple of takeaways on it here. The reconciliation bill is overall unpopular. 43% of the folks in this country oppose it, just kind of flat. And another 20% don't have an opinion right now. When it comes to questions about Medicaid and SNAP, there are very few people who really want to make cuts to those programs. In fact, many people actually support funding these social service programs more. Pretty significant majorities. When you look at Medicaid, you've got 47% who would like to see Medicaid funded more, and another 30% who would think it should be funded at least the same. Let's see if I can do some math. That's 77% of people don't think that Medicaid should be cut, right? If you want it funded the same or increased more, you won't support cuts. And yet that is exactly what this reconciliation bill does. It makes the most cuts we've ever seen to a Medicaid program, $863 billion worth of cuts. Likewise on SNAP, very few people seem to really want to see SNAP cut. You've got 70% of people who either think it should be funded the same or funded more. And yet, again, that is one of the two programs that is getting the most cuts in order to finance essentially um, ta tax cuts that reduce the amount of revenue the government has to spend. So just showing you that there is a real disconnect between what the bill does and what people know about it. A lot of folks don't know that the bill will increase the deficit, but many of them think that the bill will not, in fact, make their taxes lower. And that's another interesting finding, right? Because, in theory, if you were to do a bill that is promoted as a tax cut bill, you would think that many people would think their taxes would go down for that. And so, this result tells us that there are lots of people who don't trust that the tax cuts in the bill will actually directly benefit them, which is interesting. So Congress is aware of what the polling is on this bill, and they have three options. If you have a bill that's unpopular, you might want to pass it very quickly before people know what it does. If you think if people know more about the bill, it would become less popular rather than more popular. Or you might try to convince people that the bill doesn't do what it actually does, or convince people that they should like what the bill does. And we talked about last week that there are a number of members who really feel like they need to say things that aren't true back to constituents in order to kind of deflect or make it seem like the bill does something different than what it does. The other option is they could slow down and change the bill to take out or change the things that people don't like, which is maybe how we would assume legislation should work, right? When you have many, many people who are saying this doesn't seem like it's a good idea, then maybe you try and change the bill so it doesn't upset as many people. So where are we in the reconciliation process? A lot has happened this week. We're kind of moving along towards the week of June 16th. We talked a lot about the parliamentarian last week and her review of the bill to determine if there were certain provisions that had to come out because they weren't budgety enough, essentially, to be included in a budget reconciliation bill. Her report came out Tuesday, and it did identify a few items. There have been some committees that have released, kind of some bare bones text about changes that they would like to see in the bill. We are anticipating as soon as tonight, probably late tonight, the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over Medicaid, could release, what its changes to Medicaid are. And this morning, it seems like they may delay that until next week. Again, shortening the time between when something is publicly released and how long people have to review it before we're into a next step of the process. So next week, we really are thinking that most of the tweaks to the bill are going to be argued and hammered out behind closed doors. And the real question is, what changes need to be made so that 51 senators will agree to vote yes to the bill? And the following week, on the 23rd, they're still claiming that they're going to get to the timeline where they might do a full Senate vote in 2 weeks. And they're still telegraphing that July 4th is their goal for passing the bill out of the Senate. So a lot of stuff is happening. We're going to go through some of the items that we are hearing about are being discussed as potential tweaks. Remember, the US Senate is starting with the House version of the bill. That's what they're editing. And advocates have been saying the more different the two bills are, the better it is, because then it's farther from what the House has already agreed to pass, and it may make it more difficult for them to agree to. The Senate looks like it is doing tweaks rather than major changes. And it's doing small changes because it knows that the more different the bills are, the less likely the House is to pass it. So what are the things that the Senate parliamentarian has said? Okay, these can't be in the bill as they are currently written. And why is that important? There are certain rules of what can and can't go into a budget reconciliation bill. Remember, a budget reconciliation bill is a special process that only requires a simple majority vote, 51 senators, rather than 2/3, which is 60. So this is a strategy to have as few votes needed as possible in order to pass the legislation. So it becomes really important that all of the language in the bill meets the criteria the Senate parliamentarian has to be in a reconciliation bill, because then the bill can pass with fewer votes as opposed to passing with many more votes. This isn't the only time the Senate parliamentarian is going to get involved. She did her review of the bill and identified these items that you see on the chart, but all of the Senate Democrats can look at the bill and argue and make a case for other provisions that they don't think pass the Senate rules and should be removed from the bill. And that often happens where you have Democrats that say, hey, actually, this piece of language here doesn't meet the rules. Parliamentarian, can you make a decision on that? And sometimes the parliamentarian will listen to the argument and remove those items. So we should expect that Democrats will identify a number of items that they would like to see removed and make the case for doing that. The important thing on this chart here is that there are a few items here that have some price tags to it. And remember, the other thing about this budget bill is all of the tax cuts, the amount of revenue being reduced that the federal government has to spend, is supposed to be offset by spending cuts. So there's a lot of kind of a scale happening here, where if your changes mean that you are reducing the amount of cuts, or that you are increasing the amount of revenue that isn't coming into the government, you become more and more unbalanced. And a couple of these provisions have some pretty high price tags. So for example, having to remove the employee retention tax credit, okay, that is $6.3 billion in spending cuts that now have to be made up by cuts somewhere else. And on the other side of the ledger, there are some defense intelligence and missile programs that was adding 2.5 billion. That's a cost increase. So if you're taking that out, you have less cost increase on one side, but also less cost reductions. And all of that math has to now be accounted for as the Senate is making more decisions about what additional cuts to add, or additional revenue reducers to add, or additional things that they're taking out that would increase revenue. There was one piece in the Byrd rule that we were watching, and that includes the policy about increased food aid for households that also qualifies for heating and cooling assistance. That provision was buried in the Agricultural Committee and would have reduced the amount of food assistance for some SNAP beneficiaries. So that is a piece of policy that we were watching that appears to have to be striked. And I think it's being struck because it was more policy than it was actual budgetary items. The rescissions bill, it passed yesterday, the House. But the important piece to note is that the items that the Senate parliamentarian identified in the reconciliation bill that needed to be removed were wrapped into the rescissions bill. So you have this bill that is intended to claw back funding from foreign aid and from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that also now has in it the things that need to be removed from the reconciliation bill in order to keep the low number of votes the same. It's obviously I didn't update the slide from last night. It did have enough votes to pass the House because it passed the House. It is unclear what its fate is in the Senate. There are some senators that are uncomfortable with the cuts to public broadcasting. If I had to guess, I would say that based on past behavior, this bill will pass. Just because the senators have a habit of saying they don't like something and then managing to vote for it anyway. But it's important that these two items now are connected. So the Senate is considering what changes to make. And overall, they are making small changes rather than big changes. Part of their decision making is about what they're not going to change, right? What are they keeping the same in the House bill? And then, as you're thinking about what changes they're making, who benefits from those changes? So when you start looking at, who are the interest groups that might be lobbying senators to keep something in or take something out, there's a number of different kind of usual suspects. States do have a lot to say about, hey, you're going to hurt my state, or if you're going to make things cost more for me if you do this thing. Senators are from states and they often take that into account. There are interest groups like insurance companies, for example, that may see certain changes as being not good for their business model. Taxpayers, and of course there's lots of taxpayers, so which ones are you more concerned about? And individual people who might be in programs. Those are just some of the groups of people who are affected by provisions in this bill. And as you think about what are the senators deliberating in terms of changes, think about which of those groups are benefiting from a change or are going to be impacted because the Senate isn't changing something. Just a quick reminder, here are the main things that we've identified as impacting Wisconsin now on the Medicaid provisions. So again, the prove you're working or exempt requirements, all the extra paperwork and red tape, these are all things that really do impact individuals, right? You have to prove you're already working to get in, what happens if you lose coverage. Again, eligibility checks twice per year at least for child, adults, and badger care. All of those things are really impact individuals, and put the responsibility on individuals for completing more paperwork and red tape and following up to make sure that they keep their coverage. And there are, of course, a couple of things that do impact the state pretty significantly. It costs a lot to implement those new programs. Remember, the new DHS analysis showed that it would cost us $74 million a year to administer the Prove Your Working requirements. That's a cost to the state that they don't pay for now. Provider taxes, that's definitely an impact to the state if you cannot raise as much revenue from that current mechanism, those types of things. But most of the stuff that is on this chart are really things that impact individuals and either create more work for individuals or impact, how much of their bills are covered. So what is Congress really considering in terms of tweaks to Medicaid? They are thinking about changing that provider tax. So the House has said we're going to freeze provider tax revenue at whatever the state is currently doing now. And that would put kind of a cap on what Wisconsin's provider tax revenue is, and we couldn't do any more than that. So think of it as a stopping of Wisconsin from being able to raise more revenue by raising provider taxes. The Senate is willing to be more aggressive, it seems. They are might be more interested in finding more savings by cutting the provider tax revenue, how much states can raise down to 3%, which is half of 6%. And some senators seem to be fine with or arguing for eliminating states' ability to use these kinds of taxes for revenues entirely. So the Senate in this case is doing something that is more significant than the House passed bill. However, the original proposal in the House was much more along the lines of what the Senate is considering. So there was certainly support in the House for something much more stringent than what ended up in the final bill, closer to the original proposal that the House considered, essentially. So, in terms of results, this would impact states and it would likely create some budget holes for states, and it limits the amount of revenue states could raise for their Medicaid programs using this mechanism. That's one change that they are thinking about when it comes to making changes to Medicaid. The other potential tweak is on the work requirements. But I want you to pay attention to this because the focus of this tweak is really about when it goes into effect. Not anything about what is it that people have to do or clarifying the exemptions or allowing states to automatically exempt certain kinds of people. The whole focus on this tweak, at least as what we're hearing, is to delay the implementation maybe a little bit. And you can kind of see that the House wanted to implement this earlier because it would save, the earlier that it's implemented, it would save more money, right? And there are some senators who are saying, well, if you do it too fast, states won't have enough time to be able to implement it. This isn't really changing the substance of the requirement. It is not about the individuals who are in the program and making it easier for them to stay in the program or to prove exemption or giving clarity to states about what is it that they can and can't do. So even if the Senate decides that they're going to implement this slightly later than 2026, it doesn't change the substance of whether or not to do it. and it doesn't change who it affects. It changes when it goes into effect. And I think that's an important takeaway is, when the Senate is considering changes, it doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to resolve the problems that ordinary people will face because of the policy. Moving to SNAP, I highlighted one of these items because that is the major provision here that seems to be up for debate in the Senate. The Agriculture Committee did release some of its text, so we know what they are thinking for sure on how to change this provision. And of course, I've crossed out one item here because that's one of the items that the parliamentarian said, I don't think we can include that in the bill. So of the 6 elements we were watching on SNAP, only one of them is really up for debate in the Senate to be tweaked. And once again, the biggest thing that impacts individual people is expanding who is subject to work requirements, and that is not being changed. So the tweak here, it is really about the state match for SNAP. And the House provision said, hey, all states, you pay nothing, you pay 0% to get our federal SNAP dollars. It was 100% federally funded. The House provision said, hey, states, we want to require you to pay a match before you can get any money from us. And we want you to pay 5% of the total cost. 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but it is when you have, billions of dollars of SNAP aid coming into the state. And the other piece of the House provision is that it said, hey, states, for those of you who have error rates that are too high, we're going to ramp up how much you have to pay up to 25% if your error rates are too high. So what the Senate did is say, okay, we are going to not have states pay 25% match, but the states with the highest error rates have to pay 15%. And states with a payment error rate lower than 6%, you guys don't have to pay any match. So that's the status quo. If you have a very low error rate, then we won't make you pay any match. But if your error rate is too high, then you've got to pay a lot more. All of that tweaking reduced the cuts from 300 billion estimated in the House down to 211 billion. Wisconsin has a low error rate. The bill would also remove any tolerance for errors. So, it's hard to know if that will impact and make the error rate grow up. So it likely, Wisconsin will end up in a position where maybe it won't have to pay the match. However, it doesn't change the fact that the state has to pay more to administer the SNAP program and has a lot more work to do. So some of the other changes that are in the bill remain. And it's certainly still an increased cost to the state when you look at all of the other provisions in the bill. Now, since the Senate reduced the amount of cost savings in SNAP by about $80 billion, now that begs the question of, are they going to find additional cuts somewhere else to get the same amount of cost savings? The ACA marketplace, here's a list of the changes that we are watching. And you can see that there's really 5, and I've put on here that the bill doesn't include any extension of the marketplace subsidies to keep premiums low. Those are set to expire in 2025. So these are all things that many folks feel will make marketplace plans much more expensive, not only in premiums, but also extra cost share, and will result in loss of coverage. And the Senate hasn't been particularly forthcoming on whether or not they're going to make any changes to those provisions. But the general conventional wisdom is if they make any changes, they're going to be very small on those provisions. So, again, when it comes to what changes are being considered that most impact ordinary people and individuals, it doesn't look like there's a lot of movement here to make it less impactful for people who rely on ACA marketplace changes. Over the last week, there's kind of been some back and forth about, well, maybe we should add in some Medicare changes to the bill on the Senate side. That's a place where we haven't made cuts. Maybe there's something that we could do there. The House doesn't have really that many specific Medicare provisions, although it is enough out of balance and increases the debt enough that it would cause an automatic cut to Medicare just because it's so out of balance. The Senate has kind of said, well, maybe we can add some things to Medicare and that we think will target fraud, waste, and abuse. And for many of you who have been on these webinars for some weeks, you will know that fraud, waste, and abuse is kind of a phrase that becomes excuse is maybe not the right word, but close enough to make changes to a program, right? Like it's a justification that if the changes are being done with the intent to address fraud, waste, and abuse, then they're okay. It's totally unknown what kind of changes they might be considering. There was an interest in maybe doing some reforms on Medicaid Advantage plans. And it seems like in a few days, we went from, really doing reform on Medicaid Advantage where there is a known problem where healthcare providers kind of use the codes to upcharge or get more money, reimbursement levels. It is a known issue, and there were some senators who were like, we have this bill that addresses this. Maybe we can add that to this reconciliation bill. It appears that that has been taken off the table, mainly because the insurance companies did not excuse me, the insurance companies did not like that idea very much. So it remains indetermined if the Senate will add any specific provisions on Medicare, and we will have to wait to see what the language is. If the overall bill increases the deficit even more or it stays the same, then we're still in a situation where automatic cuts continue to be a threat to Medicare. There's also a ton of different dialogue going on about, okay, we have all of these tax revenue reducers. Should those tax cuts remain the same? Should we add more? Should we remove some? And I've given kind of some of the main ones that are in the bill right now in the House. There was some talk by the Senate of removing the no tax on tips, the no tax on overtime, and the no tax on Social Security benefits over the past week. And now all of that talk has ceased. Those big revenue depressors will remain in the bill. There's also some interest in making certain business taxes in the Senate permanent instead of expiring in some amount of years. That obviously adds a lot of cost to the bill. So that would be, again, when you think of deficit spending, if you decide that you're not collecting certain revenue permanently, that does mean that you are reducing the amount of revenue coming in even more. The state and local tax continues to be a point of contention. The Senate would like to see the amount that people can deduct be lower than what the House says. And there's also interest in adding more taxes stuff. So when it comes down to what is, and the Senate Finance Committee has jurisdiction over Medicaid and taxes. So that becomes a really important committee because it does both things, to look at when you're trying to decide whether or not this bill is going to increase deficit spending even more than it does now. And obviously, if you keep all of the House tax provisions and you extend some of them permanently and you add more provisions, you're making the cost of this bill much higher. And the question remains, are you going to do spending cuts to cover that increased amount of money that you don't want to take in? So all in all, what the Senate is discussing in terms of tweaks to this bill doesn't really change what the Medicaid cuts mean for individuals. We're still seeing the most federal cost savings coming from Medicaid SNAP cuts, and those cost savings are coming from the provisions that make it harder for people to get in or stay in Medicaid and SNAP. They are not addressing the issues that impact ordinary people the most. They're not going to decrease the paperwork or the red tape, which we know will result in people losing health care or food assistance. And they're not changing or making it easier for states to implement a new prove you're working or exempt eligibility requirements. So all of the things that are probably most impactful to individual people are staying relatively the same, at least with what we know now that the Senate has been discussing. There's been a kind of flurry of articles this week that are exploring more and more of what these provisions in the current bill will do. And there's a lot of changes to the ACA marketplace plans that are really, in many ways, some people are calling it ACA repeal light or repeal by paper cut. And some people are saying, hey, there's enough changes that when you think about the changes in the bill and potentially the people not having any subsidies, it could really impact the ACA marketplace markets themselves. Kaiser Health News put out a pretty good fact sheet saying, okay, here is how they call it the mega bill, which I think is fine. The mega bill undermines the Affordable Care Act marketplace plans. Again, some similar themes: more enrollment hoops, coverage delays, less time to sign up, higher premiums and out-of-pocket costs. All of this means increased paperwork that is more time sensitive and higher costs for the consumer, which for many people may either mean they lose their coverage because of paperwork mistakes or they simply can't afford the coverage anymore. There's also some interesting studies that are coming out about the value of Medicaid. It's a rather dramatic title, but in terms of health economists, this is exciting for them. And you can see, Medicaid matters to people's survival. I don't think that's a statement that any of us would disagree with here, especially folks that have, some pretty complex long-term care or medical needs. We know that Medicaid is critically important to people surviving and being able to thrive. And here's a study that quantifies that you do have a significant part of people who are enrolling in the program whose lives are being saved because they have health care coverage. excuse me. There have been a number of studies that have tried to predict how many preventable deaths will happen if people lose healthcare coverage. So now that we kind of have the Congressional Budget Office has estimated 16 million people will lose coverage between the changes to Medicaid and the ACA and the sunsetting of premiums. There are starting to be number crunchers who are saying, okay, well, how does that translate into lives lost? And you can see that there's a conservative estimate of, if that many people lose coverage, it will probably mean 100,000 to 140,000 more avoidable deaths over the next 10 years, just because people do not have healthcare coverage. And there's starting to be some more, kind of high level analysis of what this bill would mean to different states. Wisconsin has not expanded Medicaid to people making between 100% and 138% of the federal poverty level. And you'll see that's true of others, some of the other green states as well. Those are also not Medicaid expansion states for the most part. And there are many provisions in the House bill that do target expansion populations in the states that have expanded Medicaid. So we are slightly greener because we didn't, we have less to lose essentially because we didn't do the expansion in the first place. But that doesn't mean that the changes in the House bill don't impact us. They do, they just impact us less, right? And when you look at this particular model, which doesn't predict all of the decision making the state has to do, think about it in terms of a pretty conservative estimate, we lose about 6% of the federal spending baseline. And that translates into between $4 and $6 billion less money coming into the state for specifically Medicaid in the next 10 years, which is a big deal for a state budget of $50 billion a year. Another table projects the uninsured, how the uninsured rate will go up just based on the changes that are in the reconciliation bill. Wisconsin has a relatively low uninsured rate at this point, but again, they're projecting, roughly 96,000 people will lose their insurance just by the bill alone. And again, our state's own analysis shows that to be higher when you factor in the subsidies expiring at the end of the year. Our state's projection is between the Medicaid coverage losses and the ACA marketplace losses, we might be looking at about 250,000 people losing insurance. Kaiser also has been doing some polling, its own polling, and there are lots of people who are pretty worried about what federal Medicaid cuts would mean for them. There are people who are worried that it will lead to more people being uninsured. There are lots of people worried that hospitals, nursing homes, and other care providers in their communities are going to be impacted if Medicaid cuts go through. And more importantly, 90% of the people who are in Medicaid, are saying they're at least somewhat worried that federal Medicaid cuts will negatively impact their care and their families' access to care. Half of low-income adults say they have, or a family member they live with has problems paying for food, housing, or transportation. So the people who know about these changes and know what the impact of Medicaid is to the overall economy and to healthcare in particular, and the people who use the programs really do understand that what these cuts may mean for them, and none of those are positive outcomes. There's also been a number of folks from Arkansas and Georgia, which are the only two states that have ever tried to implement work requirements, talking about their experience and saying, hey, we lost 18,000 people lost coverage in 5 months when Arkansas tried to implement prove you're working or exempt requirements. And it is an experience that kind of foreshadows what could happen, in every state. Um, so a lot of people with disabilities lost their coverage. It's a good opinion piece if you want to, written by legal aid attorneys who were talking about their clients and the kind of people who lost their coverage. And it really does, confirm some of the things that we've been talking about for months. There isn't a way to target harm in Medicaid. Once you start targeting Medicaid, you target everybody who's in Medicaid. And there was a lot of collateral damage done by this policy. Also a fact check this week, the Office of Management and Budget Director was making some comments in the public that out of every $5 or $6 in Medicaid payments, one of every $5 or $6 in Medicaid payments is improper. That is absolutely not true. And so if you need another fact check sheet to refute some of that stuff, it is here. It is a concern that we keep repeating the same things that are not true in a public sphere because it ends up being very confusing for people, but it isn't true. That the vast majority of improper payments are really about mistakes. They're not about deliberate criminal fraud activities. And some folks were at Senator Johnson's town hall. Again, he kind of selected the people who were allowed to attend his town hall and selected the people who could ask questions, but he still got a question about Medicaid. And the constituent asked, hey, can you provide some examples of fraud, waste, and abuse? And he gave an example that was not from Wisconsin, first of all, and tried to make a connection between somebody who with a disability being on a waiting list in New York because the money was being spent on able-bodied adults. I just think we need to be very clear here that nobody is like able-bodied people are not taking care away from anyone. That's a strategy that's trying to pit people who are in Medicaid against each other. You are not going to get more if some able-bodied person loses health care. If able-bodied people lose health care, that doesn't mean people with disabilities will get the same or more care. It just doesn't. So this is really a false argument. And frankly, many states do waiting lists because the people who are waiting for home and community-based services tend to be the folks who need more care and are more expensive. And that is a way that states can control how much they're spending, is by controlling how many people who are higher cost are in the program. So we've covered some of that stuff before, but I think it's important now to understand that, different people in everybody who's eligible to be in Medicaid is eligible to be there. And it isn't really about one group, impacting or taking away care from another. That isn't how this works. And just this gentle reminder, like when you're thinking about, how much do we spend on different Medicaid populations, where the most money is invested is generally children with disabilities and adults with disabilities. It's not the able-bodied adults or the children who are relatively low cost to cover. And as a reminder, most of where the costs are in Medicaid are those optional Medicaid services. 50% of all of the spending in Medicaid is on home and community-based services, family care, IRIS, CLTS in Wisconsin. So this is why we keep saying, you know, if you make big Medicaid cuts, the place to look for savings is really not the able-bodied population who costs less. It's going to end up being, you know, the programs that impact people with disabilities and older adults the most. And that's why it's such a false flag to kind of claim that because there's a waiting list for a person with a disability on a home and community-based service waiver, if you didn't have that able-bodied adult, there wouldn't be a waiting list. That's untrue. Where we're spending the money is there. And if states feel squeezed, every time in the last 12 years that a state budget has had an issue and they have looked at ways to cut their Medicaid programs, it's been in the optional home and community-based services because that is where there is most money to be saved. He also, Senator also talked about, offered a second example of fraud. And again, it's unclear if he was talking specifically about provider taxes or state payments, but it doesn't appear that that was necessarily true either. So just to kind of remind people that it's important to ask the questions because he, you know, at the town hall, you know, he didn't have a ton of people asking questions, but one was still on Medicaid. And it's important to participate and ask those questions because it's important to hear what they have to say about those questions. It's also important to hear those answers and question them because they may or may not be true. They may represent more rhetoric than truth. All right, so we're closing in. There are a few things to update on the president's administration. There are now starting to be a few administrative rules that are coming to the surface. Usually in the past, there's been a public comment period and a review period, but that seems to not be as much of the case now. And every federal agency has their own regulations to make sure that people who get money from them comply with accessibility requirements. It's called Section 504. We came across, one of national folks came across that the Federal Department of Energy has, you know, kind of bypassed the public process requirements and is now saying, well, maybe we don't need to do those 504 requirements for new buildings. And I think that this is something that we should be watching for, because if they are doing it in one agency, it is likely that there could be other agencies that are doing the same thing since every agency has the Section 504 rule. And that really means that, you know, if this rule is removed, it removes accessibility standards. And it kind of undermines some of the access standards that are currently in place that we've taken, you know, not for granted, but we've come to assume would always be the case. So there is something you can do about this. And I just think that we should be aware that this is a strategy that may be used in multiple agencies. There are two places, two links that you can submit public comments on. And the goal again is to not write a white paper, but just to say, hey, this doesn't pass the smell test. You can use the same set of comments on both dockets, but you know, it is important for lots of people to show again that they are paying attention to these kind of very quiet ways that accessibility and other things that help people with disabilities can be eroded. The detailed budget tables were released. I have not found all of them for everything, but we did get a copy of the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families and Communities budget tables. And there's some good news in here. It does, first of all, confirm that all the aging and disability programs are moving, that are currently in the Administration for Community Living are moving as one to the same area, which is a big deal, and it's a result of your advocacy. There are programs that have had small or even significant cuts. The DD councils are funded at $80 million, down from 81. The protection and advocacy for, I believe, people with DD are level funded. There are some programs that have proposed increases, and even significant increases. And several programs where their individual appropriation lines are being eliminated, including USAID's Voting Access for People with Disabilities and Limb Loss Paralysis Resource Center. Interestingly enough, the Independent Living Center state grants got a really big increase. I think $100 million increase, and the tables do say that do allow the ILCs to use that increased funding to fund the programs that are being eliminated. So that is not guaranteed funding, right? The appropriation line for USAIDs and voting access and those things that were their own appropriation line are no longer there, and there's kind of a workaround of, well, we've given the state independent living centers more money, so maybe they can figure out if those are priorities and continue funding them or not. It's kind of a gray area, and of course there may be states that choose to do, things differently depending on the state. So it's not the same as guaranteed funding, but it also isn't the same as completely eliminated and no one else can fund that work. It's kind of somewhere in between. The Office of Management and Budget Director has been kind of in the news because he's a big proponent of using impoundment and other things, and has recently been talking about using pocket rescissions, which is trying to codify cuts that have been made this spring close enough to the spending deadline where Congress doesn't need to act in order for the cut to happen. Congress does seem to be saying, at least a couple members, that they don't like that very much, but I think it's something to keep our eye on as we go into the fall. The Office Management and Budget Director is very strategic and smart about things. So it's hard to know, what kind of strategy he might employ and how that could be impactful to programs important to people with disabilities. Okay. Remember, small changes to the mega bill are about solving a very simple political problem. What set of things can get 51 votes in the Senate, and what can get 218 votes in the House? That is the problem being solved. Voters still don't know necessarily what's in the bill, and this is where you can be extremely influential. 45% still don't know that the bill has Medicaid cuts in it, and 50% don't know the bill has marketplace cuts in it. And I bet you that some of the people who don't know about the Medicaid cuts or the marketplace plan cuts are people who are in Medicaid or have marketplace plans. And 56%, I have the wrong word here, did not know that the bill could impact Medicare, because again, the level of deficit spending in the bill can trigger automatic cuts. So that gives us a lot of people to work with over the next couple of weeks to kind of get in, help them understand that these things are going to impact them directly or family members, or frankly, just impact the healthcare system enough that there could be some real impacts for their access to care. Everything you're doing matters. I know that lots of people are, you know, you've been doing all the things for a long time, and it's sometimes hard to kind of see that all the things that you're doing collectively really matter, but they do. And you're adding to the volume of content out there about Medicaid, and the more volume there is out in the universe, the more likely it is people will run into some of it and can start becoming more informed or change their minds. So we've got to be persistent at this point. It's also useful to be personal. You know, your personal relationships and experience make you very credible to the people you know. When you think of Medicaid cuts, think of me, right? There's no protecting me from Medicaid cuts. Those are the types of things that you want people to have in their minds as they're thinking about, oh, these things do impact somebody I know, somebody I care about. And the last thing is, be public, because the more people hear and see what Medicaid cuts mean, the better. Lawmakers need to understand how many people are watching, and even though they aren't making as many tweaks as we would like them to see, you know, you have made Medicaid a major issue that is being watched and it is being covered. And these, you know, never for one moment think that this is over until it's finally done. You know, we saw even 3 weeks ago, the House, you know, really make some significant changes to the bill in a matter of hours, right? So sometimes whether or not a change happens is more about political will and political pressure. And that's all the things that you're doing are helping add to the case that Medicaid changes and SNAP changes are not the way to go. Excuse me. I think it is time to call the question about, like, hey, you're making some changes to Medicaid, but you're not doing the things that would help most of your constituents. That is an important point, that you know that you're watching, you know, that you see that they're not making things easier for the people who already have the hardest time. I think it's time to call folks on that. And also, Democratic senators, they need to be as public as possible, as often as possible, to the widest audience possible, as much as possible, about Medicaid cuts. You know, it is really time to ask them to do more, because, you know, we're in a space where in the next couple of weeks, this is the time that we have to influence at least the Senate. And here are some specific things that you can ask senators to remove. If you are looking for what do I tell them to do? What do I want removed from the bill? Remove the prove you're working or exempt requirements. That impacts ordinary people really pretty significantly. Remove the increased eligibility checks for Medicaid, which would impact Badger Care childless adults in this state. Remove the marketplace changes to make it harder to get or stay in plans and make plans cost more. You might even say, hey, we don't need all the tax cuts that you're putting in. I'd rather have the revenue coming into the government to pay for these things than see my tax bill go down a few dollars. Up to you, but I think these are some ideas of what could be removed from the bill that would make the most difference. So again, who's being helped by the bill? Is it you? Because it might not be. If constituents are saying they don't like many parts of this bill, why are the changes they're asking for not being considered? That's the question to be asking your senators now. And don't forget the House folks, because whatever comes out of the Senate, the House is going to have to vote for it again. And the House has the opportunity to amend the Senate version of the bill. They can also take out items that impact ordinary people, even if they thought they were saying, even if they voted yes for them before. Remember, a lot of House members last week were saying, oh, I didn't know that that was in the bill. I would never have voted for the bill if I knew that was in there. Well, now they know, and they'll have another chance, and they can make changes to it. We aren't that far away. They can vote against the bill. They can block together to make changes. And, you know, if we get a situation where the House and the Senate is very different, you could see the bill go back and forth or go to a conference committee. There's actually lots of time to make significant changes to what ends up in this bill. So in conclusion, here's what we know. We know this bill doesn't guarantee people with disabilities won't lose Medicaid or lose benefits. We know it doesn't have any specific strategies to address fraud, waste, or abuse. It doesn't protect Medicaid for the future by cutting it. We know lots of people will have less healthcare coverage or lose it altogether. And we know when people lose healthcare, their costs go up for the uninsured, health and long-term care providers and states. A lot of these changes were not meaningfully debated, and you as constituents are pointing out the impact and asking for changes. It's time for our lawmakers to start listening to what people are asking and doing what they're saying. And you guys have been very, very persistent on some of these issues. We need to keep being persistent, you know, all the way through to the end. I'm going to stop.
All right. Excuse me. I think I have Tammy's frog too.
Yeah.
Two questions. One was just a little bit about understanding the provider tax. I think that's hard for the kind of question was, can you give more information about the provider tax and how it impacts the situation?
Yeah. And the reason I haven't covered it in depth is like, it is not the most impactful change for Wisconsin, and it isn't an impactful change necessarily for individuals. What the provider tax does is every state except for Alaska uses this mechanism to kind of pull down more federal Medicaid dollars to use in their states. And what they do is they tax hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and nursing homes in Wisconsin. And they take the money from the tax that they give, and they use that money as part of their required state match. Okay, so in Medicaid is a program where the state has to put in about 40% of the costs, and the federal government puts in about 60% of the costs. So this tax revenue that they're collecting from those providers ends up being part of that 40% that the state is using for its match. And the idea is when you tax those groups more and more, you have more of your match covered by those tax revenues, and you pull down the more money from the feds. And then what the state does is increase the provider rates so that when those providers who are taxed provide care to Medicaid patients, they get the higher rate. In other words, they pay the taxes, but they get their money back and a little bit more because the state's saying, because you're covering more of our state match, we're going to raise the rates so that we pay you more for providing care to the Medicaid patients. Is
So
that
it's
helpful?
a win-win at the moment.
It is a win-win.
Yep. Okay. And then there was just a question about the 504 stuff. So someone asked, doesn't ADA cover those accessibility? Which, yes, ADA does cover accessibility, but in this provision, it's really talking about those buildings that are federally federal funding, so they can still make that change. I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, how I would characterize it is, again, it's a pattern, right? It's a pattern of what can the federal government do in all sorts of ways to make things less accessible instead of more accessible.
Correct. I think that's great. All right, that's it. Everything else I think we got. You're right on time.
We will have the links sent out this afternoon. I see there's a question in the chat there. And
Yeah, we can't answer questions live, so if you had a question, you have to put it in the chat.
okay, so we will have the after message sent out this afternoon.
And then Beth is just reminding people to please fill out our survey. It'll pop up when you when we close out.